In the spring of 2007, at a tack and Western equipment trade show held at the Kerrville Fairgrounds in Kerr County, Texas, a regional equipment buyer named Terry Mack looked at a folding table covered with horsehair saddle pads and said, "This is a county fair project." She was not unkind about it. She held one of the pads up, turned it over, looked at the stitching, set it down. "Handsome work," she said. "Not what we carry." Walt Pruitt, who was 60 years old that spring and had driven 2 hours from his place in Bandera County to set up that table, said nothing. He thanked her for her time. He loaded the pads back into the truck. 12 years later, in October of 2019, a horseman named Hank Lassiter sat in Walt's shop on the south edge of Bandera County and wrote a purchase order for 180 saddle pads at $340 each. The total was $61,200. He wrote the check without negotiating the price, which told you something about what he thought of the pads. He asked only one question before he wrote it, and the question was not about the price. That is the span this story covers. 12 years and one question. What happened in between is the part worth telling. Walt Pruitt was known in Bandera County for 2 things: his quiet and his fence line walks. Every morning, weather allowing, he walked the north fence of his 105-40 acres from the county road gate to the cedar break at the back corner, 1.25 miles each way, with his blue heeler ridge at his left boot. He had walked that fence since his grandfather, Olin, deeded him the place in 1987. He did not do it to check the wire, though he checked it. He did it because the fence was where he thought. Olin Pruitt had run a saddlery out of the same property from 1946 until he got too stiff to hold a needle in 1984. The shop was a limestone and cedar plank structure set back 60 feet from the county road, with a good north-facing window for working leather and even light. Olin had built it himself the summer he came back from the war. Using stone he quarried from the creek bed on the east side of the property, and cedar posts he cut from the break at the back. The window was a deliberate choice. He wanted north-facing light, because north light does not shift with the sun, and you can read the grain of leather in it without the shadows moving on you while you work. Walt had spent every summer of his childhood in that shop. He had learned to cut leather there, to punch holes at even spacing, to set a rivet without leaving a ring mark on the face side. He learned to press a saddle pad and listen for the sound the hair made when it seated right, a kind of muffled settling, the way sand sounds when you press a palm into it. He was not a born craftsman in the sense that it came easily. He was a born craftsman in the sense that he could not leave something alone until it was right. When Olin died, he left Walt the shop, the tools, the 140 acres, and a ledger. The ledger was a green cloth-covered accounting book, the pages filled in pencil in Olin's square, deliberate hand. Half of it was income and expense from the saddlery years. The other half was something else. It was a technical record. Pad construction specifications, horsehair density measurements, compression tolerances written in pounds per square inch, sweat channel geometry sketched in the margins. Olin had spent 4 years working cavalry remount during the Second World War, evaluating horse tack for long-haul service. The remount program was the branch of the Army that kept horses in service during the last years, when armies still used them in significant numbers, and Olin's specific job had been pad and tack evaluation. Riding horses across difficult ground over long periods and documenting the state of their backs afterward. He had done this systematically. In the pencil in the ledger way, he did everything, and by the end of the war, he had a specific and precise understanding of what separated a pad that kept a horse sound from a pad that broke one down. He had come away from that work with strong opinions about what kept a horse's back sound over distance. Walt kept the ledger in the shop on a shelf above the bench, under a piece of waxed canvas to keep the dust off. He had read it once, carefully, the winter after Olin died, and then he had let it sit, the way you let something sit when you understand it, but are not yet ready to use it. He was not making saddle pads in 1987. He was running stocker cattle on the 140 acres and doing occasional repair and custom work out of the shop for the local horse community. Bandera County is horse country in the specific sense that the town of Bandera calls itself the cowboy capital of the world, which is a Chamber of Commerce formulation, but underneath it is something real, which is that the people in that county have been working horses in rough cedar and mesquite terrain for 4 or 5 generations, and they understand horses the way people understand things when they cannot afford to get them wrong. In 1994, a mattress manufacturer called Comal Comfort opened a factory on the county road a quarter-mile north of Walt's Gate. The plant made inner-spring mattresses and employed about 80 people from Bandera and the surrounding area. They used horsehair in their tufted mattress panels. Walt did not know this at first. What he knew was that, by the summer of 1994, someone was dumping bales of raw horsehair outside his north fence, along the bar ditch between the road and the cedar posts. He drove up the road and introduced himself to the plant manager, a man named Dennis Haas, who had come down from San Antonio to run the operation. Dennis was a production man, organized and practical, and he had a production man's discomfort with waste streams that cost money to dispose of properly. Horsehair tufting for mattress panels generated a consistent trim surplus. The hair that did not make it into a panel had to go somewhere. The county landfill charged by the pound. Walt's fence line was not only convenient, it was free. Dennis was not embarrassed about the hair. He explained the situation plainly and asked if Walt wanted him to stop. Walt said he did not want him to stop. He said it without explaining why, which was his habit. Dennis arranged for a truck to make a regular drop. By the following year, it was arriving monthly. Compressed bales of raw horsehair, mostly dark brown and black, some gray, baled in metal-banded squares about the size of a hay bale. Walt would see the truck from the back pasture and walk up to the gate and drag the bales inside before they could get rained on. He palletized them inside the old limestone barn where Olin had stored finished saddles, stacking them on cedar pallets to keep them off the dirt floor. By the end of 1996, he had a corner of the barn stacked 4 pallets high with hair he had not processed or used. He did not know yet exactly what he was going to do with it. He knew what horsehair was. He knew what his grandfather had written about it. He kept walking his fence, and he kept stacking the bales, and he let the idea develop at the pace that ideas develop when you are patient and have enough room to store what you are waiting on. Let me tell you about horsehair, because what it is and what it does is the whole of the story. Horsehair is not hair in the sense that most people picture hair. The fibers are hollow. They are coarser than human hair, springier, and they have a natural crimp structure that gives them a particular quality when compressed. They push back. Compress them into a pad of uniform density, and they do not collapse and stay collapsed the way foam does. They return to shape. That return to shape quality is called resilience, and in a pad that sits between a saddle tree and a horse's back through 8 or 10 hours of working movement, resilience is not a luxury. It is the difference between a pad that distributes pressure evenly across the bearing surface and a pad that loads pressure into high points, which is where pressure sores begin. There is a second property. The hollow fiber carries and disperses moisture. A horse working hard generates heat and sweat under the saddle. And a pad that traps that moisture creates a warm, wet environment against the skin. Over time, that environment softens the tissue, reduces blood flow, and produces the same breakdown that a hospital patient develops when they cannot shift their own weight. The horsehair pad wicks moisture away from the contact surface and lets it disperse through the pad body. It breathes. A third property is less obvious and took Olin 4 years of remount evaluation to document. Natural horsehair, when compressed to the right density and held in that compression by a cover stitched at the correct grid spacing, will conform over time to the specific shape of the horse it is fitted to. A foam pad compresses uniformly. A horsehair pad at Olin's specified density compresses differentially, giving slightly more where the horse's back is higher, holding firmer where the tree bears down hardest. After 60 or 80 hours of riding on one animal, the pad develops a memory of that animal's topography. It is not interchangeable with another horse's pad, which is why Olin's shop had always built to the horse rather than to a catalog size. That same non-interchangeability was the thing that made it invisible to Terry Mack's catalog. A catalog sells sizes. A pad with a memory sells to one horse at a time. Olin had understood this in 1946. He had written it down in the Green Ledger, including a density specification of 4.2 pounds of processed hair per square foot of pad at 3/4 inch compressed thickness, which was the value he had found through field observation across 4 years of remount evaluation. Walt found the specification when he was 43 years old and read it the way you read something that confirms a thing you had always suspected, but never had the language for. He began processing the Comal Comfort hair in 2001. By then, the barn had 18 pallets of baled hair, organized by year and batch. The raw hair required washing, drying, and combing to remove the mattress processing residue, which was primarily a light mineral oil used to keep the fibers pliable on the mattress production line. That oil had to come out. Hair with processing oil on it would not hold its compression set. Press it, release it, and the fibers would not return because the oil was allowing them to slide against each other rather than locking at their crimp points. Walt tested this directly. He washed a sample batch with hot water and a mild detergent, dried it on wire frames in the sun for 2 days, and then pressed a test block and measured its return height at 24 hours, 48 hours, and 1 week. The washed hair returned to within 6% of its original height at 1 week. The unwashed sample was still partially compressed. He built a wash rack behind the barn from galvanized pipe and garden hose fittings and dried the cleaned hair on flat wire frames in the sun, turning the frames in the afternoon to expose the underside. He combed each batch with a wide-toothed steel carding comb, working in small amounts across his lap on the workbench, and then loaded the combed hair into a wooden press he had built from 2x12 oak planks and a pair of threaded rods. The press produced a block of compressed hair at a target density. He checked by weight. Each block should weigh out at 4.4 pounds per square foot, of face area at 3/4 inch compressed thickness. He adjusted the press plates until the weight was consistent. Then he cut the blocks to pad dimensions, stitched them into a cotton duck cover on Olin's old treadle machine, and bound the edges with latigo leather, hand-stitched with a waxed saddle thread at 8 stitches to the inch. He worked at it in the evenings and on Sundays, the way you work at something that is not yet paying for itself, and may not for a while. Delia would bring coffee out to the shop and set it at the corner of the bench and go back to the house without asking how it was going, because in 30 years of marriage she had learned that Walt worked better without the question. The first pads he made in 2001 went onto his own horses. They were still on those horses in 2007. By 2007, he had accumulated, across 13 years of Dennis's monthly drops, approximately 68,000 pounds of raw hair in various stages of processing. He had refined the density specification through his own observation, settling on 4.4 pounds per square foot at 3/4 inch, slightly above Olin's 1946 figure, because the contemporary riding horses he was fitting tended to be narrower through the withers and benefit from slightly more resistance under the tree. He had 7 pads on local horses and had been encouraged by a farrier to show them at the Kerrville trade show in the spring. That was where Terry Mack told him it was a county fair project. Terry Mack had been in the equine equipment distribution business for 11 years by 2007. She held a market analysis certification from a regional business school in Austin and had built a catalog that served about 400 tack shops and feed stores across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. She was good at her work. She understood regional demand, she could read sell-through data, and she was correct that handmade horsehair pads were not what the market was ordering in 2007. The market was ordering synthetic felt and foam pads from 3 national suppliers who could deliver by the pallet and price to volume. She was not wrong about what the market was doing. She was wrong about why. Boyd Kemper had operated a saddlery and tack shop in Bandera for 22 years when Terry came through to make her first regional call in 2007. Boyd was a good saddler. He had gone to school for it, had apprenticed with a man in Uvalde who had apprenticed with a man in Del Rio, and he knew his craft. He also knew, as he told his wife in 2007, that the craft was not going to pay the light bill by itself. He had watched the saddle pad market shift toward synthetic felt and foam over the preceding decade, and he understood the economics of it. A synthetic pad at $28 wholesale moved off his wall at $38 retail, and it moved quickly because people could see the price. A handmade pad at $300 required a conversation and a horse standing still for a fitting, and most people did not come into a tack shop looking for a conversation. He signed on as a regional distributor for one of Terry's synthetic pad suppliers. He financed an inventory floor build-out with a banknote at 6.5%. The note was for $47,000. His plan was sound by the numbers he had in front of him. Boyd's shop and Walt's shop were 11 miles apart on roads that any horse person in the county knew. They were not rivals in any meaningful sense because they were not competing for the same buyer. Boyd was selling volume to the general horse community. Walt was making pads one at a time for people who had asked him to. Their paths crossed at the feed store and at cutting trials and occasionally at the Kerrville show. They were friendly in the way that men in a small county are friendly when they have known each other for 25 years and have no particular reason for friction. In 2010, Terry was back in the county to do a regional catalog review. She stopped at Boyd's shop where the inventory floor was full and the sell-through numbers were good, and she stopped at Walt's fence because a mutual acquaintance had told her Walt was still making pads and she wanted to be fair. She walked the shop. She held the pads. She set them down. "I can't put folkcraft in a regional catalog," she said. "It's not scalable." She said this not to be cruel. She said it because she genuinely believed that what could not be measured in units per hour and shipped by the pallet could not be worth very much. Walt said he understood. His granddaughter Claire was 14 years old that spring, visiting for the summer, and she was sitting on the tailgate of the truck when Terry said it. Claire remembered it years later, not because it stung, but because of how Walt did not answer. He just turned and went back into the shop, and she heard the bench creak when he sat down. Ridge was in the truck bed, and Claire sat with her arm around the dog and listened to the shop sounds and did not go in for a while. Claire enrolled at Texas A&M in 2012 in equine science. She was a good student. She learned biomechanics, saddle fit, tissue physiology, pressure mapping technology. She learned all the things that could be quantified and put in a study. She came back to Bandera in 2016 with her degree and a clear picture of how the equine equipment industry was organized, and the picture confirmed most of what Terry had been saying for a decade. Terry was at a regional trade event in Kerrville that same summer, and she ran into Claire and was friendly and direct. "Your grandfather's making hobby pads," she said. "Sweet work, but the market's moved on." She said it with the confidence of someone who had the data. Claire went home and looked at the pads on the horses in the south pasture. She looked at them the way you look at something when you are trying to decide whether you have been missing something or whether you were right all along. She had been right all along, she thought. She went back to the house and said nothing. Walt had sent 6 sample pads in the late summer of 2017 to a cutting horse barn outside Weatherford in Parker County, run by a horseman named Hank Lassiter. Hank had come through a cutting horse trial in Bandera County the previous fall and had noticed the pads on 2 of the horses that placed well in the open class. The pads looked old-fashioned, which is not a term that would occur to Hank as a criticism. What he noticed was that they looked as though someone had thought carefully about them. He asked where they had come from. Someone told him. He found Walt's number in the county directory and called. Walt sent the 6 pads in a cotton flour sack, with a note that gave the density spec and the latigo specifications. He did not include a price. He said Hank could send them back if they were not useful. Hank put the 6 pads on 6 of his training horses that fall and ran them through a full cutting season. If you have spent any time around cutting horses, you will know that the work is precise and physically demanding for the animal in a very specific way. The movement is lateral and abrupt. A cutting horse stops hard, drops a hip, swings the forehand across, stops again, all in a space that might be 10 feet wide. The total number of hard stops a training horse makes in a working session at a serious barn can run into the hundreds. A saddle that moves under that motion is not a saddle doing its job. A pad that compresses and does not return leaves the saddle moving, and a saddle that moves will eventually produce soreness at the points of contact, which will change the way the horse moves to protect the sore spots, which will change how they perform, which is a problem that compounds and becomes expensive. Hank had been through a lot of pads in 30 years, and he had a clear sense of what a pad's job was. He called Walt in the spring of 2018 and said the 6 pads had held through the season, and that the horses' backs looked as good in April as they had in September. He said that was not a thing he could say about the pads he had been using before. He said he noticed that each pad had conformed slightly to the horse it was fitted to, and that if you pressed the saddle contact surface, you could feel where the tree had borne down most. He asked about price, and Walt told him. Hank said he would be in touch. If you have ever watched someone dismiss a method because it could not be measured at scale and then watched the scale things collapse and the method remain, you probably know what this story feels like from the inside. The comment section is open if you do. Walt Pruitt spent 13 years walking that fence and never once complained about the pace of things, which is either a character trait or a philosophy, or the same thing looked at from 2 angles. Something worth pausing over if you follow this kind of work. The people who tell you something is not scalable are usually measuring the wrong thing. They are measuring whether a method produces units per hour at a cost that fits a spreadsheet. They are not measuring whether the thing the method produces actually does what it is supposed to do. There is a gap between those two measurements, and in that gap is where Walt Pruitt had been working for 13 years. Claire had been back in Bandera for a year when Hank called, the second time in the fall of 2018. This time to say he wanted to talk further. She drove out to the shop that afternoon and helped Walt sort a batch of processed hair while he told her about the call. She worked the carding comb through a section of fibers and did not say anything for a while. Then she asked about the compression return rate on the sample pads. Walt told her what he had measured. She set the carding comb down and picked up one of the finished pads from the bench and pressed it. She watched it return. In January of 2019, the equine equipment industry received a voluntary recall notice from a major synthetic pad supplier. The antimicrobial compound applied to the contact surface of their most widely distributed line, a compound designed to inhibit bacterial growth in the warm, moist environment under a working saddle, had been flagged by the United States Equestrian Federation's Welfare Committee. The specific flag was its connection to a cluster of pressure sore cases at 3 high-performance barns, 2 in Texas and 1 in Florida, where horses had developed lesions at the saddle contact points that the barn managers and veterinarians could not attribute to saddle fit or rider error. The Federation's Welfare Committee had been tracking the cases for 6 months before they went public with their finding. The supplier had been notified privately before the formal advisory was issued and had made the business decision to issue a voluntary recall rather than wait. The supplier pulled the line. Retailers were required to remove the product from sale and file for return credit. Boyd Kemper had $47,000 in inventory from that supplier on his floor. He had been selling the line for 8 years, and it had been his best-moving pad product by volume for 6 of those 8 years. He pulled it. He filed the paperwork. He built a return pallet in the back of the shop and loaded it himself, stacking the pads in their plastic sleeves, 48 to a box, and sealed the boxes with the tape. He had 12 boxes. He waited 4 months for the return credit to process. It came back at 62 cents on the dollar. Boyd did not talk about this publicly, which was his right. Walt did not ask him about it, which was also his right, and the more important one. In Bandera County, 14 of the 18 tack operations that carried the recalled product were affected. 2 of the smaller ones closed within the year, not directly because of the recall, but because the recall was the kind of disruption that a thin margin cannot absorb without consequence. 3 of the 14 did not reorder from any synthetic pad supplier after the credit resolved. They moved to smaller pad inventories from regional manufacturers, or they stocked nothing at all in the pad category and sent customers to shop online. The county's equine equipment market was not the same on the other side of 2019 as it had been going into it. Walt's pads were not affected. The horsehair was what it was, processed the way Olin had described processing it, with no chemical treatment beyond the mineral oil wash he had been doing since 2001. There was nothing in the pad that could be recalled because there was nothing in the pad that had not been there when the horse was alive. Dennis Haas drove down from San Antonio that spring, not on factory business, but because he had read about the recall in a trade publication and had seen Walt's name mentioned in a regional equine newsletter alongside the phrase, "Horsehair saddle pads, Bandera County." He parked at the gate and walked in through the door of the shop and stood looking at the pallets of processed hair and the bench and the presses and the carding combs hanging on their pegs. He stood there a while. "I didn't know," he said. He meant the hair. He meant what it had become over 13 years in Walt's barn, and Walt's press, and Walt's hands. Walt told him he was welcome to stop by whenever he liked. Como Comfort had completed its transition to foam filling in 2018, and the Horsehair drops had ended the previous fall. The plant closed entirely in early 2019, a casualty of the same consolidation that was restructuring the bedding industry. The building sat dark on the county road with its loading docks sealed in plywood. The north fence line had been quiet for 3 years and would stay that way. Claire had been watching the recall unfold from every angle available to someone with an equine science background. She had read the Federation's Welfare Committee reports, the case studies from the affected barns, the tissue pathology descriptions of the lesion patterns. She had her own understanding of pressure, sore mechanics from her coursework. She knew exactly what the recalled compound had been designed to do and why it had failed. She came out to the shop on a Tuesday evening in February with a printout of the Welfare Committee's summary report and set it on the bench. She did not say anything. She read the shop for a moment, the presses and the hair and the ledger on its shelf, and then she asked to see it. Walt brought the ledger down and set it on the bench and opened it to the density specification pages, the pages with the sweat channel geometry sketched in the margins. Claire read it standing up. She read it again. She sat down and read it a third time. How did he know the compression tolerance? She asked. Walt told her about the remount years, the horses across difficult ground, the systematic documentation. She asked more questions about the specification development and about how the density figure had been arrived at and whether Olin had tested different densities in sequence or had arrived at the 4.2 figure through field observation alone. Walt answered what he knew and acknowledged what he did not. They talked until it was late, and then she went to the house, and he heard her car start and drive away and come back an hour later. She had gone to the gas station in town for coffee because the shop did not have a coffee maker. She came back in and set a paper cup on the corner of the bench and asked if she could photograph the ledger pages. He said yes. Hank Lassiter drove to the shop in October of 2019. He did not call ahead. He arrived in a clean white dually just after 8 in the morning, when the light was still coming in at a low angle through the north window. He came in through the shop door and introduced himself to Claire, who he had not met, and shook her hand and asked if he could look at the production process. Walt showed him. Hank watched him load the press, thread the threaded rods down by hand, and then tighten the top plate with a long wrench handle until the gauge he had mounted on the side read the target compression. He watched Walt weigh the block. He watched him transfer it to the cutting table and mark the pad dimensions in chalk and cut the block with a long-bladed knife, 2 passes per side. He watched him settle the block into the cotton duck cover and run it under the treadle machine, stitching the cover closed on 3 sides before folding the cover, and stitching the 4th seam standing fold so the seam allowance would not bear against the horse. He watched him set the binding, the latigo cut to width with a strap cutter, punched and stitched at 8 to the inch. Hank watched all of this without commenting. He stood in the shop with his hands at his sides and watched the way someone watches when they are already fairly certain about something and are only confirming it. When Walt finished, Hank picked up the pad and held it. He held it for what felt like a full half-minute. He pressed the saddle contact surface slowly, with the heel of his hand, watching the compression, then released and watched the return. He pressed it again. He turned it over and looked at the underside, the hair visible at the edge of the cover where the binding overlapped, and he ran his thumb along the hair there and felt the crimp. He held it again, How many can you make in a month? Hank asked. Depends on how I'm going, Walt said. 60, maybe 70. Hank nodded once. What's the longest a pad has been on a working horse? He asked. 7 years, Walt said. One of mine still measures within 4% of original height. Hank set the pad down on the bench with both hands, flat, the way you set something down when you have decided about it. $340, Walt said. He had said it the same way he had said it to Terry Mack in 2007, and to every person since. The price had not changed. The reasoning behind it had not changed either. It was what the work was worth. Hank said nothing for a moment. Claire was at the far end of the bench, sorting processed hair, and she did not move or speak. Then Hank said, I want 180. He pulled a purchase order form from the inside pocket of his jacket. He had brought it with him, which meant he had not been undecided when he drove down from Weatherford. He wrote the quantity and the unit price and the total and handed it to Walt. The total was $61,200. He asked one question before he reached for the checkbook. Can you keep the backing latigo, or do you ever substitute? Walt said he kept the latigo. Hank wrote the check. $340. The figure that appears on that purchase order is not a number about a pad. It is a number about 13 years of morning fence-line walks and a ledger kept on a shelf under waxed canvas and 68,000 pounds of material that a mattress plant had counted as a disposal problem. The number landed in that shop with a weight that had nothing to do with the exchange it authorized. Everyone in the room understood that without saying it. Claire set down the carding comb and looked at the check in Walt's hand and looked back at the hair she had been sorting and did not say anything for a long moment, because there are things that ask to be held before they are spoken. Walt called Terry Mack a week later. He was not calling to inform her. He was calling because she was a person who had been fair with him across 12 years, which is not nothing, and because she deserved to know how it had come out. She was quiet for a moment after he told her about the purchase order. Then she asked if he was taking on new accounts. Her voice was measured and careful. It was the voice of someone who has been wrong about a specific thing in a documentable way and is making an honest accounting of it. He told her he had 9 shops he was working with already, and that the production cap was 800 pads a year, and he was not looking to grow past that. She asked if he would send her the contact information for the shops, because she had clients in overlapping markets and wanted to understand the landscape. He said he would. She asked one more question. She asked how he had gotten the price to $340 and whether that was materials and labor or whether there was a different calculation. He explained it plainly. The labor was $12 per pad in his own estimate. The materials were $8 in thread and cover and backing, and the rest was the value of the thing the pad did to a working horse's back over 7 years, which was not a calculation anyone else had been making when they priced their pads. She was quiet again. She said, I think I understand what I was measuring. He said he appreciated that. Boyd Kemper reordered eventually from a different synthetic supplier with a shorter catalog and a cleaner chemical profile, because he was a tack shop and he needed pads on the wall and his customers asked for them. Walt never raised the subject of the recall with him when they crossed paths at the feed store or at a trial. Boyd did not raise it either. That was its own kind of understanding. There are situations that settle themselves without requiring a statement, and this was one. The 9 shops where Walt's pads sold by 2021 were distributed across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. They were found through word of mouth, almost exclusively, from barn managers and working horse people who had fitted a pad on a horse and seen what the horse's back looked like 8 months later, and asked around about where the pad had come from. Walt had not advertised and had not sought out the accounts. The accounts had found him, one at a time, which was the pace he preferred. Claire ran the production side by 2020, having moved her belongings into the farmhouse in March of that year, and set up an office in the back of the shop where the old treadle machine cabinet stood. She had brought her pressure mapping equipment from the university contacts facility, a portable sensor array that could produce a visual map of the pressure distribution under a pad during movement, and she had used it to test 10 of the existing pads on 10 different horses across 3 months. The maps confirmed Olen's density specification and supported a modification of 0.06 of a pound per square foot for one product line she called the narrow bar variant, for horses with a particularly steep wither angle, where the standard density was bearing slightly high. The modification went into the ledger in her handwriting, 1 page after Olen's 1946 entries. Her figure was more precise than his because she had instrumentation he had not had. His was the field observation that had made instrumentation worth running. Walt handed the ledger to her formally, on a morning in March of 2021, at the bench where Olen had worked and Walt had worked after him. He did not make a speech about it. He set it on the bench in front of her and said it needed a new piece of waxed canvas because the old one had gone soft along the spine. She said she would take care of it. She picked it up and carried it to the office cabinet and set it on the top shelf, then came back with a length of new waxed canvas from the sewing supplies and cut it to size and folded it over the cover without being asked. Como Comfort had closed the factory in 2018 when they completed their transition to foam filling. The building was empty now, the loading docks sealed with plywood. The north fence line had been quiet for 3 years. Walt still walked it every morning, ridge at his left boot, the cedar posts going gray at their tops the way cedar does in that country. The hill country hills rolling off south in every direction, under a sky that does not change very much, from decade to decade if you are paying attention. What the mattress plant saw in that horsehair was a waste stream, a disposal problem. The landfill cost avoided by the convenience of a fence line. They were not wrong by the measure they were using. There are 2 ways to measure a thing. One counts what you can put on a pallet. The other asks what happens when you press it and let go. For 13 years, the fiber that one system counted as surplus was, by the other measure, accumulating into something specific and patient and understood. The recall exposed the difference not because it changed the fiber, but because it removed what had been hiding it. A method that survives a structural shock does not survive by luck. It survives because someone spent a long time learning the difference between what a market measures and what a horse's back knows. That knowledge is not scalable. It does not fit a catalog or a per-unit cost analysis. It fits a ledger, and it fits the hands of the person who has read the ledger and checked the fence and pressed the pad and felt it come back. What endures is what pays attention. Ridge was sleeping in a patch of afternoon sun on the shop floor the morning Walt handed the ledger over, his gray-blue coat rising and falling against the old limestone. The same dog in the same spot he had been sleeping since Claire was small enough to sit on the tailgate and listen. The ledger was in Claire's hands. The bench was the same bench. What had changed was who was bending over it. And that was exactly as it should be.